Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the items we have for you this week, an unidentified and mysterious illness has killed at least 27 people in the Congo. Yeah, this is not a good start to a movie. No wait, it's reality. Shit. A whooping cough epidemic in South Australia. A withdrawn article from COVID-19 that was claiming that vaccines were causing adverse myocarditis events. And well, as you can imagine, the withdrawal was not that surprising. Misokenia, a phenomenon in which people find fidgeting an excruciating thing to observe. The increase in certain GI tract cancers are associated very closely with certain diets. The thinnest spaghetti ever made. A feel-good item from the Victoria Police media. A strange recall over organic eggs. Actually, that makes it a very reasonable recall. The world's largest gold deposit has been found. Nigerian excellence appears to actually be something of a myth, and Japan has declared victory in their war on floppy disks. These news items and others can be found at the timestamps given below. Let's start with new and exciting diseases, or at least it probably will be once we figure out what the hell's going on in the Congo. As with all places that have Democratic or Republic in their name, the Congo is, well, not necessarily either of those. But what it definitely is experiencing a mysterious disease that has killed at least 27 people in just over a month. Yeah, this is not good for a variety of reasons. First of all, the symptoms are fairly benign and not very obvious. It starts with a fever, headache, and a cough. And it appears to be affecting just about everybody, including children. After this, well, people get sicker and sicker and sicker, and then eventually they die. You know, there was a movie that started in a very similar way, except it had a monkey, and at this stage we don't have a link to monkeys for this event, but well, reality is taken after fiction more and more lately, and with Idiocracy being a documentary rather than a, form of entertainment, maybe we're seeing the same thing? In other news, we have the stupidity around claims that the Pfizer mRNA vaccines lead to the identification of large amounts of DNA. Now, there's already a problem with this, and it's kinda simple. It's RNA. You know, the whole thing where you learn your 26 letters of the alphabet. R and D are different. Sure, they're both nucleic acids. One is deoxy, whereas the other one is ribose. And the key thing here is that, typically speaking, RNA does not get turned back into DNA in the human body. So, yeah, this is a concern, and for plenty of good reasons. The next is, simply that they found the DNA in vials of RNA-based vaccine, and it's, again, not that surprising. The whole premise is you need DNA to make RNA. Literally, it's a one-way street where you go from one thing, DNA, into the other thing, RNA. Okay, you might be thinking, well, they've found DNA though, so clearly there's something wrong here, and not really. What they found DNA for is a specific kind of viral vector they were using to be able to create the mRNA, and more importantly, maybe to modify the actual bacteria to be able to produce it. So it's not exactly a case of saying, well, is it actually a worry? Because all they've really done is show, well, there's some residual material left over from the production process. So yeah, this is not really all that important. More so when everything they've found really only does one thing, and that is, it ends up further stimulating the immune system. Yeah, this is not like it's actually a negative in some respects. Sure, finding it's an indicator that perhaps quality control's not as great for some reason, but it is still an indicator that there's something extra in there that doesn't have a net negative effect, but you should certainly be aware of it. In other disease-related news that's arguably an actual concern and something we should be dealing with, there is an outbreak of whooping cough in South Australia, in, unsurprisingly, Australia. It's one of their states. They've named them creatively. West Australia, North Australia, South Australia. Weirdly, though, no East Australia, although there is a New South Wales, which is neither South nor Wales. Strange. Anyway, long story short is that the outbreak is essentially a result of people being stupid and thinking a vaccine's bad, much like the previous news item, except rather more long-running. So, yeah. Easy solution? Get yourself vaccinated. In fact, you should get yourself vaccinated if you have any concerns, if for no other reason than the next news item, which is all about a teacher who died from rabies after trying to rescue a bat. The bat got into their classroom and they tried to do the right thing, as you should for most animals, which is, essentially, get it back outside into nature where it belongs without harming it. Of course, if that animal is carrying a exciting disease like rabies and you get bitten, you're probably out of luck unless you get treated for it very soon after. And understand, the rabies vaccination schedule is not fun. It's a very large needle, it's a fairly large shot of the vaccine, and it doesn't go into places that you would typically expect. It's an abdominal shot. Basically, you need a nice large muscle or fatty mass to be able to accommodate the big injection, so it hurts like hell. But it is better than rabies and then death. This does, however, bring us back to the whole why are people so damn hesitant to be vaccinated, and it owes to articles like the one that's recently been withdrawn, on which the claim was the COVID-19 vaccine causes myocarditis. Now, this was a terrible article from the very start since it relied on theirs, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, which, to be clear about it, it is a useful tool, but it's more like a signpost for things to investigate. It should not be relied on as a thing itself telling you about events. When you can claim that things like vaccines caused you to get drunk and drive, meet up with hookers or whatever else it is, you know theirs is not to be relied on. At least not in that respect. And this is where the withdrawal of the article is so damn funny. They were trying to claim that the vaccine caused myocarditis. And yeah, it might well do. It's not to say it doesn't. But there's a huge difference in the degree of myocarditis from a vaccine versus COVID. It is, to use a rough analogy here, the difference between a matchstick and your house burning down. The vaccine is the matchstick. COVID-19 is your house burning down. And so, you should very, very much so consider what it is that's being published and why. The other thing that we can note from this particular article is that, Peter McCullough is one of the most retracted authors of late. That is, they keep publishing things and then having to pull them out of circulation because they're wrong, which really should raise red flags for any editor and reviewer of their work. In a slightly less, let's say controversial news, although arguably still going to be controversial, it's the use of cannabis. Now, that by itself is controversial, but it's supposed changes, epigenetic changes, in one study. We should point out that it's not necessarily a huge study at about 1,000 individuals. And what they found were changes supposedly related to various activation, or in some cases deactivation, of certain genes for bodily function. Arguably important bodily functions. Not things like erectile dysfunction, although some may see that as an important function. We're talking about other more day-to-day things that are kind of important for your long-term health, not your long-term happiness. What makes this study arguably far more significant than others is both its duration, but also, we're not just talking about surveying people and asking them, do you use cannabis? Instead, it is 20 years, and the individuals, when they were recruited between 18 and 30, at the 15 and 20 year mark, they were able to provide blood samples. Now, this tells us something being key here, as we know about towards the end of the time frame. That is, we know after 15 years of cannabis use, this may be true across a large portion of the people using it. We don't know if the people who are using it were already like that and that's what's predisposed them to use cannabis, but still, it's more significant in terms of what it's done than a lot of other studies that have just tried to claim this, that, or the other with regards to cannabis. Why we say this is that they are reasonably conservative in what they're saying is related to its use. There were a fair number of markers associated with cannabis use in the short term. They also looked at the longer term use and then found way more markers. So it's 31 associated with cumulative use that they thought, okay, this is interesting, and that's at 15 years. At 20 years, there were 132. But in total, they've said, okay, we think there might be somewhere between 16 and 30 of these are actually relevant and something we should explore further. In things to explore further, we have Misokenia. It's something that affects about 1 in 3 people, and it's essentially when you become very annoyed by people becoming fidgety. Now, this is obviously going to be something that different people will view very differently, mostly because some people will find it agitating, others will find it actually vexing and excruciatingly frustrating, but others themselves will look at it and go, yeah, I do the same thing. So this leads to the question of what's going on? Well, it's a weird phenomena, and it is, well, rather understudied, and for good reason after all. Asking somebody, does fidgeting bother you, is probably going to get a pretty strong response, one way or the other. The condition is somewhat similar to misophonia, in which people become frustrated with certain repetitive noises, for example the word moist. Well, no, that's one thing people get annoyed by, but that's actually different again. But what's key here is that Misokenia is an area that is understudied. In fact, there's very little study at all. And that makes this research useful, but it's very much a preliminary study exploring the field. It involved about 4,000 participants, and they were trying to figure out the prevalence of it to start with. The prevalence was looked at inside of university students and people from the general population, so we may not be able to extrapolate it out to the wider population just yet. Mostly because university students seem to be a population all unto themselves. Interestingly, the researchers believe, and understand this is a preliminary explanation, is that the thing triggering this frustration are mirror neurons, and they're intended to allow you to understand what somebody else is doing, in a manner of speaking. Very broadly, mirror neurons are a phenomena where part of the brain is dedicated to going, okay, that person is doing whatever action. That action, if I was to do the same thing, is because of whatever. And so they can begin to at least somewhat empathize with them. In other neurology-related news, we have dopamine and caffeine. In this case, though, it's not arguing that caffeine will lead to dopamine release and therefore a reward, but rather sort of how it is that coffee, amongst other things, interfere with dopamine and lead to a certain degree of addiction. What the researchers have argued is that, to some extent, the use of caffeine, let's say in tea or coffee, could be blocking the role of dopamine and thereby essentially creating a learning mechanism or let's say a reward mechanism that means that you want to consume coffee because coffee is good, and anyone who says otherwise is a heretic and should be burnt at the stake for being a witch. No, wait. Let's ignore that last bit. What coffee does do, that is far more justifiable, and certainly far less controversial, is interfere with various metabolic processes, particularly in the brain. So, for example, blocking the conversion of alcohol into seltzolinol. This is something that triggers the dopamine release and makes drinking more or less pleasurable. There's also instances where they believe it could be interfering with morphine, which does mean that caffeine could be a good way to prevent let's say, as strong an addiction, although you would arguably be replacing one addiction with another, and just arguably a less destructive addiction, at least for anything but the environment, because if Brazil's anything to go by on coffee plantations, then coffee's kind of destructive. It does, however, sort of back up the old practice of filling someone up with a pot of coffee if they're hungover or if they're really drunk, to make them not hungover or drunk. Although in this case it would indicate that rather than affecting them at the time, it's going to affect them later on when their body realizes that was a really terrible decision. And their brain reinforces that by going, yeah, don't release dopamine when that happens again. In other news related to the body learning things, although this time all the wrong things, we have GI tract cancer and its increase. Now, the increase in cancer is not that surprising, at least over the last couple of years, because well, prior to that, there was a sudden drop due to people not being able to leave their house. That does, however, mean that the catch-up is a problem. We've now sort of, although not necessarily at the same level as pre-COVID, managed to make up for that to some degree. What we haven't done is explain the other increase in cancer. there is a surprising increase in people under 50 who have bowel cancer, which doesn't really hold with what should be happening. Typically speaking, bowel cancer happens when you get older, not younger, and so it would indicate, at least somewhat, that there's another behavior going on that is causing it, and researchers believe it's a consumption of red meat and processed meats, along with fast food, refined grains, alcohol, and sugary beverages. The very things that young people tend to eat, which, yeah. Now, in case you're unaware, the GI tract runs all the way from your mouth to your anus, which means there are a lot of cancers that can occur all the way along that route. It's also why cancers are one of the most leading causes of diseases in the world, as any cell in your body can become cancerous. One problem we do have with this study is kind of obvious, but not so obvious if you take what they're saying at face value. They're arguing that foods rich in antioxidants, berries, leafy greens, fruits, vegetables, etc., are good for you, and they should, in theory, prevent cancer, or at least be anti-inflammatory, but not so fast. Excessive antioxidant intake actually leads to the opposite effect and can be contributing to cancer. So, yeah, everything in moderation, essentially. That does lead us to the next alternative, which is, well, alternatives to meat, and dairy for that matter. And sadness. Lots and lots of sadness. However, meat and dairy are arguably areas where dietary consumption are higher than they need to be, but nonetheless, meat is enjoyable and cheese is delicious. So why would you not have them? Well, the answer is people don't, because they taste terrible and they're expensive. So how can you try and do this without breaking your wallet, the bank, and possibly going broke, especially if you shop at Whole Foods? The answer is a newer study that says these are the alternatives you should look at, particularly for meat and milk. Their first and obvious suggestions are going to be things like tofu and tempeh, because these are basically long-running options that have been around for a very long time now. The tofu is basically a meme at this point, and tempeh less so. But you also have veggie burgers and plant milks, which how they milk the plants is still a mystery. It's also interesting to see how they milk a nut, but that one's probably not something we can show on YouTube, as we'll get in trouble. The study took a fairly simple and relatively appreciable examination of this. They compared the health, environment, and cost, and then had an overall score based on that. And they then ranked everything as is. And top of the food chain, so to say, is beans. And again, this is not a surprising thing. Beans are high in fiber, low in fat, and reasonably nutritious overall. Sure, they're not perfect, because the more you eat beans, the more you'll toot, according to at least one children's story, song, rhyme, something like that. But nonetheless, they are very versatile and very effective. But then you have things like lentils, which are often used in veggie burgers and similar, or plant milks. Although, again, why on earth you would want to milk a plant is weird. Finally, they basically list a lab-grown meat in the last possible position, which, again, isn't that surprising. And not only is most of it not available across most of the world, but you have issues around byproducts of production, facilities, time, etc. So, no, it's not necessarily the best option, but depending on how you look at this, well, it might be the best option if you're refusing to go down the other pathways. In other food, we have the world's smallest bit of spaghetti. Oh, actually, it's not spaghetti, but it is spaghetti in terms of what they've made. It's just 372 nanometers across. It's hundreds of times thinner than a human hair, and you might be asking yourself, why? Why do you need to make tiny, tiny spaghetti? The answer is not so much for culinary purposes, although theoretically you could, it would just be a waste. What they want it for is medicine. In theory, because of what it is, how it's made, and so on, it could be used for wounds and other similar applications. It's essentially a tiny fibrous mass that will break down biologically, and it's reasonably inert. Understand, we're talking about what is basically a mixture of flour and water. So, yeah, it's not going to really do much to cause harm. Understand, it can cause harm, but it doesn't anywhere near as much. It is significantly better than artificially packing the wound with various things. But at the same time, because it is biological, if anything gets in there, like bacteria, well, it's a source of food for them. So there is limitations to this, but there are also some significant strengths. One of the arguably weaknesses of this is that rather than the, let's say, typical kind of spaghetti you would think of, which is basically flour and water, this is instead having to be substituted. They still use essentially flour, but they can't use water because of the method they use to make it, called electrospinning. If they had water in there, it just wouldn't be able to pass through its small hole and generate the spaghetti filament. Instead, they use formic acid, which you might be thinking, isn't that dangerous? And the answer is, well, yes, but fortunately it doesn't end up in the pasta in the end. The process of basically pushing it through that tiny hole and then into an environment where you can draw off that formic acid leaves behind essentially only these starch chains, or more accurate at that point to say, partially broken up starch chains. And this allows for a very thin, very flexible kind of fibrous filament. That filament, if then processed differently, or even if it's processed differently from the start, it can lead to a essentially very flexible, very hydrophilic, that is water attracted, matte, plate, what's the word for it given it's so thin? A wafer? Going to other confusing news now, we finally understand what makes ginger cats ginger, or at least orange. It's also taken 60 years because no cat would willingly take part in this research, mostly because cats are assholes. This is where things get kinda weird though. It's different teams of researchers have finally found the answer, which does raise a certain question as to why and where. Short answer, it's a very small deletion, small in relative terms, that's only present in very orange cats. Or, to be clear about it, every orange cat, but the degree of orange that comes from it is going to vary somewhat. There were a surprising number of cats involved in this research, which again is kinda weird. There were 145 orange cats, 6 calico cats, and 37 non-orange cats. Those that were orange had a 5 kilobase deletion in their genome. That deletion is only found on the X chromosome, which means that the orange appears to be closely associated with female lineage, meaning that if the female mother cat, or even just in general going several steps back, doesn't have the necessary mutation, the chances of it showing up again are kinda small. That one deletion, because it's primarily on the X chromosome, is then, for lack of a better phrase, interfered with by various other genes, not just on the X chromosome, but in other parts of the genome. And also, in some cases, simply because there is no other copy of the X chromosome, as in the case with males, it's far more pronounced. For females, it would be significantly less so because you have 2 copies. Sometimes the copy is 2 matching versions, sometimes it's a matching version and a non-matching version, which is where things get weird and wonderful, especially when we talk about genetics and cats, and arguably one day cat girls. Just understand, both examples of this research from this week are not yet peer-reviewed. They're on pre-publication servers, but the research does match with prior things we've mentioned in other videos. The other news we have with regards to animals is one that seems to have set people off for all the wrong reasons. A part of it is simply that it involves snakes. The other is that it involves police, strangely enough. But you might wonder, okay, what's the relationship? And this is where most of the irritation by people seems to have sprung from. It's a media report on an individual who was pulled over because they were driving erratically. Why they were driving erratically is that the woman had a snake climbing up her pants. Yeah, to be blunt, most people would be fairly sympathetic if you were driving erratically, having a snake climbing up your leg. The other thing is that the snake was not just oh, that's a snake, that's not great, it's actually quite a nasty snake. It's rather, well, to be blunt about it, venomous and dangerous. You don't want to be bitten by this thing. The tiger snake is named partly because of its coloration and partly because, well, it's terrifying. Fortunately, the woman was able to eventually pull over after weaving through traffic and fend off the snake until somebody could get there and check that she was alright, which turned out to be the police, and consequently, this particular media item. But because it was a woman, and somehow this is terrible, they've made a fuss of it in the public. Not the police, but people seeing it. Of course, the snake catcher probably wasn't too worried. They were busy wrangling the snake. The last event we have for you in terms of animals is, well, what's considered the largest predation event ever, and it involves about 10 million schooling capelin. Now, these were all devoured by cod, which means there had to be a lot of cod present, and this was just off the coast of Norway. What is really terrifying in some respects is that they were all eaten within just a few hours. Yeah, cod, most people would be familiar with it for a variety of reasons. We know it for being the weird orange fish you have to eat around Easter. You might know it because it grows in your rivers or lakes or sea or whatever it happens to be. But we didn't know that they were a terrifying threat for other fish. By itself, it's not exactly exciting. Terrifying as said in some respects, but the exciting part is less having to do with the actual event itself and how it was monitored. And what they did was something called wide area multispectral underwater acoustic sensing. Essentially, microphones with dedicated frequencies that would pick up where particular species were at different times, allowing them to track the movement of both prey and predator. What they observed in some respects is sort of similar to, say, a German wolfpack tactics. That is, U-boats would spread out and they would find themselves a nice juicy convoy of allied shipping. The German U-boats would then communicate with each other and all converge in one location where they would then attack the convoy, depriving them of their food and various other resources by sinking it to the bottom of the ocean. In this case, it's similar but slightly different. Rather than being allied shipping, well, it's different fish in the form of the schooling capelin, and the predator was, rather than U-boats, instead the Atlantic cod. In less environmentally related news, although arguably still environmentally related, just tangentially, the Costco has had to recall tens of thousands of eggs. Why, you might wonder? It's because they're organic, and organic is a dumb idea. Well, sort of, but not quite. It is because they're organic, but it's because they're organic and they turned out to be infected with salmonella. Yeah, it's that extra flavor you didn't want. And yeah, it really is that simple. 25 different Costco stores have had to withdraw the eggs and recall more than 10,000 cartons because, well, they weren't meant to be sold in the first place, apparently. The FDA said, these are not suitable for sale, and, well, somebody screwed up in the logistics workshop and said, okay, we've got all these eggs, let's send them out for sale. And it wasn't allowed for good reason. After all, salmonella, especially in the young or elderly, can be deadly. So, yeah, you don't want this. It's also another reason why buying organic is a terrible and dumb idea. Arguably, you might wonder, well, isn't all egg possible to be infected with salmonella? And yeah, that's true. All eggs can be because of the nature of what it is. It's basically something passed out of a chicken's butt. A slight oversimplification, but understand that passing through that area of a chicken, it's liable to pick up anything you don't want to have, including salmonella. The difference is the volume of recalls related to the volume of organic eggs versus the volume of recalls related to the volume of conventionally farmed eggs. The numbers, or at least the ratio, more accurate to say, that is the ratio of recalls to product for each of those two groups, significantly higher in the organic group. In other food-related news, we have RFK Jr. and more of his dumb statements. The next 4 years are going to be fun with RFK Jr. if he actually gets into some sort of official role. What he wants to do is remove high fructose corn syrup from things like food and drink, which in and of itself isn't great, mostly because it doesn't make any damn difference. Let's be clear about this. The amount of sugar in Coca-Cola, whether you use high fructose corn syrup or sucrose, is largely going to be similar. Your average or most common form of high fructose corn syrup, including that used for things like Coca-Cola, is either going to be the 45% fructose or the 55% fructose. Sucrose has 50% fructose, meaning that it's entirely arguably the case that the high fructose corn syrup used is 5% healthier or worse if you're only worrying about fructose levels. Which is actually a red herring. You shouldn't be worried about the fructose levels by itself. You should be worried about how much sugar in total. Yeah. Now, this is not to say that cane sugar or sucrose isn't a different flavor in Coca-Cola. There is definitely a difference. But in terms of health effect, there is effectively no difference. And if there is a difference, it's about 5%, which is largely within margin of error. So no. you really shouldn't be listening to RFK Jr. when it comes to your health advice. In what is healthy news, although healthy for the company involved rather than healthy for people, we have the world's largest gold deposit. It's arguably worth over $80 billion. The ore deposit found is meant to contain over 1,000 metric tons, or roughly 1,100 US tons, of gold, and it's found in central China. Now, normally we'd make a joke about this being ancient Chinese territory, but, well, this is Chinese territory, so not so ancient. The Geological Bureau of Hunan Province, which is the same place where you would find Wuhan City, found 40 gold veins about 2 kilometers deep in the northern part of the state, or province in this case, and they believe that those 20 veins contain 300 metric tons by themselves, and that there may be even more at 3 kilometers depth. Shifting from geological news to environmental news, and we have the gradual greening of Antarctica. Yeah. The frozen southern continent is apparently a less frozen hellhole and more plant and lively than we thought, which is weird. As we've said in past weeks, Antarctica should basically consist of a few isolated humans who are lonely and horny, penguins, which are lonely and horny, and seals, who are lonely and horny and possibly looking at the penguins. By taking 35 years of satellite data, they've been looking at Antarctica's change, and to be clear about it, we're not talking about the coldest, most southernmost part of Antarctica. Rather, we are talking more along the periphery. But between 1986 and 2021, there has been a notable increase in the vegetated area. While there may not have been much vegetation in Antarctica originally, over 35 years, the amount has increased by more than 10 times. It's gone from just under a square kilometer of vegetation to nearly 12 square kilometers of vegetation. It is worth us pointing out, though, that a significant portion of what is considered vegetation is essentially weird giant mossy lumps, but they are somewhat alive, and certainly a quasi-plant. Shifting now, we're going to trigger all sorts of issues, essentially with controversy, but understand we're reporting on the news, or at least a development in articles that's interesting, not necessarily that it's, well, perfect. But what it is arguably good in that it's a self-reflection, realizing that somebody is wrong and then going, I didn't actually realize that it was more complicated. And this is that people migrating to America, primarily in the form of Nigerians, were originally described as being, high achievers. What the author has found is that it's not actually the case that they're necessarily high achievers. It's weirdness. You'll understand as we go through this, but it does get a bit complicated. First of all, we have the whole idea that people who immigrate from one country to another will naturally be more skilled, and sometimes this is true, particularly if we're talking about countries with a selection process for immigration. Australia, Canada, UK, places like that where if you have certain skill sets, you are more likely to be allowed to immigrate and naturalize. Most countries, however, also have a subset of essentially humanitarian migration allowances. This is where some people from Nigeria will fit in. In other cases, they will be in the former category. Where this gets important is that as people migrate, they may or may not change once they arrive in somewhere. Sometimes they'll be successful, sometimes they won't. But the author notes that originally they held the view that people emigrating from Nigeria to the USA not only immigrated and were more successful in total, but they remained more successful in total. But then they were challenged on this and asked, are you sure about that? And do you have something to back it up? And the author's like, no, we don't, but I'll get back to you. And they have now. What they found is, quite simply, that there is a change in how people self-identify to start with. Strangely, those who are more successful tend to retain identification as being from Nigeria. In other instances, if they fall down in the social hierarchy, they tend to identify as, say, African American or similar. We also have issues around whether or not they identify as being born overseas and immigrated, whether or not they consider themselves as being born in America if they're essentially young children, and there are a range of other ways it can come about, but self-identification is not a good indicator of what's actually happening. Then we have issues around the whole standardization, that is, what's actually going on and how are you comparing things. And of course there's a range of other factors, and we're not going to go through everything in this video. Just understand that, as said, it's an interesting example of somebody being challenged on a topic and going, you know what, after having looked at the information and the data, I'm wrong, and here's why. Going to ancient news now rather than current news, we have barbarians in ancient Rome carrying tiny little spoons. And no, they're not bringing a spoon to a knife fight, or perhaps more accurate to say a gladius fight. Instead, these odd little spoons were apparently rather more useful. Well, sort of useful. It's that they were apparently used, at least in part, as a sort of ceremonial utensil for getting high or stoned on whatever drug they particularly preferred before going into combat. Drug use is not a foreign concept in war, whether it's World War II, in which everybody seemed to be on meth, later on in Desert Storm, where US pilots were on meth, in the modern world where Russian soldiers are on meth or anywhere else, and of course Florida Man. Naturally, fighting a drug-induced madman with a pointy object is no one's idea of fun, and this could well be what the spoons were for. Literally, for their drug taking. The final news item we have here is also on war, but a different kind of war. It's the Japanese war on floppy disks. Basically, Japan wants to say goodbye to them and get rid of them full stop, which is challenging given that a lot of the world still runs on them, if it isn't running on even older technology again, like magnetic tape. Remember that it took until very recently for the American nuclear arsenal to be updated to not use floppy disks, and not even the smaller floppy disks, the massive, great big chunky things, those that were almost 10 inches or thereabouts across. Unlike most of America's wars, though, this was actually over in fairly short order. It did take 3 years, but they still managed to achieve what they wanted from 2021 to 2024, and there is no more floppy disks involved in their government. They are also trying to get rid of the fax machine, although this one might be more challenging, but it is entirely possible. One of the things that has made the, let's say, aim to remove them is that a lot of the Japanese people are very resistant to change. As such, well, they kinda need to not do that. This is why it took 3 years. Despite that, the appeal of it was strangely there. You can only put about 1.5 megabytes of data on a floppy disk, and so to replace a fairly mundane, say, USB drive, you would need somewhere around 11,000 of them. So, no, you really need to swap them out, and it's why it's done now. But the war is not over, it's just shifting its focus now back to probably fax machines, which, despite previous attempts, did fail. Which is odd, because Japan's wars tend to be fairly, well, not necessarily successful, but when they end either with success of Japan or a bang. Well, 2 bangs for the most recent example. And that's all the news we had for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.